Today, I'm taking a look at the comments from my past YouTube videos and answering your most frequently asked questions. And while I answer those questions, I'm going to be doing some studio chores to give you a sense of what my downtime in between painting looks like. So we're going to be unboxing some brushes, we're going to be varnishing some paintings that you've already seen on this YouTube channel before, and just generally getting everything ready to paint today. So if you've had questions for me in the past, make sure you watch through this whole video. If I don't answer your question, definitely let me know in the comments and I will put together a part 2. And if you're looking for even more in-depth opportunities to ask me questions and get even more support for you on your painting journey, as a reminder, I do offer limited mentorship slots, so you can check out more about that and how it all works in the link in the description. All right, let's get started. Okay, so I'm gonna kick right off with what's probably my most frequently asked question, which is about varnishing. So I've been asked this in a lot of different ways, but I'm just going to read off one of the comments. The commenter says they're just curious and ask what kind of varnish I use that allows me to varnish so soon after finishing a painting. And they elaborated saying that they thought that we needed to wait months, even up to 6 months before varnishing. Okay, so this is a really good question and it has a very simple answer. And that is that in a lot of my videos, there is a gap between me creating the painting and me doing the varnishing. What you see me painting isn't real time, and I never go straight from painting the painting into varnishing. So everything is dry to the touch by the time varnish goes on the painting. And the reason that sometimes you see varnishing content in these videos and sometimes you don't is that sometimes I literally make the whole painting the day that I record the voiceover and send everything to my video editor. So I don't have time to get that varnishing footage in there. Other times I'm ahead of the game and that painting has had time to get dry to the touch, which can be as little as 1 to 2 weeks, and I can get that footage together and include that in the video. The painting is never wet when that varnish goes on, and specifically speaking to this question of what kind of varnish lets me apply it so quickly, I am using Gamvar gloss varnish. I'll include a link to that in the description because I get asked this all the time. And I actually have a whole video on varnishing that I will link as well. The thing about Gamvar gloss is that it's technically a retouch varnish, which means that the oil painting can continue to cure even after you've applied that varnish. So it's not technically considered a final varnish in like art conservation terms. But nonetheless, it is a very helpful protective surface to put on your painting. I treat it as if it's a final varnish, but the advantage is that I can get that protective layer on my painting way sooner than if I were using a standard final varnish, which yes, you do want to wait 6 months to 1 year. Okay, up next, I have some questions about how I stick my panels to my easel and how I stick them to my wall. So I have one commenter who said, your canvas seems to stick to your easel as if it's magnetic. What kind of setup is that? So this is actually something that I do go over in another video, so I will link that whole process showing you how I rig this together, but quickly, when you see everything adhered to my easel as if it's magnetic, it's because the easel is magnetic. And I put a little metal backing that is magnetic onto the back of my panel, just using command strips. That lets me like just kind of slap my panel onto the easel without having to risk touching the front of the panel to try and get it back off my easel when I'm done painting. Works with the Edge Pro Gear easel. You could also rig a magnetic setup with like a DIY easel as well, and I like that a lot. But I do not have a magnetic setup on my wall easel or my Geneva easel, which I'm going to talk about here in just a moment in case you're curious about that Geneva easel, because I know I've gotten a few questions about that recently. And then another common question is about how I'm adhering my panels to my walls, because in some of my videos you can see paintings that are sitting on my walls and they aren't framed. You can't see any hanging hardware. So the way that I adhere these panels onto the walls is via a heavier duty, like large command strip that has the kind of Velcro texture to it. It's not actually Velcro, but it works like Velcro. So you have one command strip that goes on the wall, one command strip that goes on the back of the panel, and then they adhere together really nicely. And it's easy to get panels off the wall, and it's very easy to remove that command strip from both the wall and the panel. Okay, and speaking of framing, I had one commenter say that she wishes I would talk about framing my work. She asks, do I frame my work, and do I frame commissions before I give them to clients? So, full disclosure, right now I'm not taking commissions, but if I were, there's a couple of different ways I handle this. So for commissions specifically, what I will say is that framing isn't a part of the commission process, but for local commissions, I'm happy to consult on the framing. So I'm happy to go to a framer's with my client and pick out something that I think is complementary to the work. And occasionally I have clients who say, I want a full service package. Will you include framing? And I'll include a line item for framing in their invoice. Similarly, I don't include frames with my work made on spec. This is something I might change in the future, but given that I'm fairly new to doing this full time, it was just an expense that I didn't see as being absolutely necessary, and keeping a stock of frames in my studio could get very expensive very quickly if I'm using nice frames. So I always sell everything unframed, and then I offer to frame the piece or pick out a frame for the piece or consult on framing for the piece when someone decides to purchase. Okay, so next I want to talk about my Geneva studio easel, because several of you asked about that after my studio tour. So I don't have the Geneva easel in this studio, but I do still have it. And the reason is that I have casters on that easel, which makes it a little bit taller than typical. I used to paint in a space that didn't have high ceilings by any means. I think they were 8-foot ceilings. But in this particular studio, I'm not sure how easy it was to see, but I have a really dramatically sloped ceiling, which means there's only about 2 feet on one side where the height of the room is actually a normal height. So as a result, I decided that getting that easel into this space wasn't a particularly smart idea. So I have that easel in another part of my home, and if I were working on a really large painting, I would actually move my studio space to that easel to work on that painting. So the Geneva is for very big projects, and I use it pretty sparingly since I tend to focus on smaller paintings generally. But up here, I do also have one other easel that can accommodate a larger piece, and that is my wall easel. One of you asked where I got that easel from, and that is from Paperbird Studio, which I will link in the description. Now, I did have someone ask about the size of my pieces. They said that they noticed that my paintings are generally very small, and they asked if clients generally commission smaller paintings because the price is lower. And what I will say to this is that the paintings you typically see are small because I like painting relatively small. I have a minimum price for commissions, so it's not so much that people are going small because they're cheaper. I make sure that I never take on a commission that, for me, isn't worth it in terms of what I'm getting for the time that goes into that painting. But for me, painting over a certain size, it's difficult. It takes longer. I don't often like to paint larger than life size, but I will often paint smaller than life size. So I do have minimum sizes. I never want to have to capture a likeness smaller than the size of my fist, for instance. That is too small of a size to capture someone's face for me. So that's one limit that I have. But typically I like to paint anywhere from a 6x8 all the way to maybe a 12x16, and I'd say those are the sizes I'm really comfortable with But that's just me, and I'm sure that can change over time. Okay, a couple questions about the rest of my studio space. So someone commented that I appear to have an empty dish rack in my studio. And yes, that dish rack is there to hold panels while they dry. It was empty during that studio tour, but it actually has several paintings in it at the moment. So that's where I like to put panels when they are wet, so that they can dry with like minimal risk of dust or cat hair or anything else settling on them as they dry. And this was actually something I got a question about from someone else. Somebody asked how I avoided getting cat hair in my my paints or my paintings or varnish or anything else like that. And the short answer is that thankfully my cat really doesn't invade my studio space. Like, she does come into the studio, but she never hops up on my painting surfaces or anything like that. If she did, I would definitely have like different boundaries around the studio. I would like make sure the studio door was always closed so she could never come in here without me, or I would try and like shoo her away from this space. So I think if you're in the position where like your cats are getting cat hair in your paints or your paintings, I would see what you can do to potentially create a little bit of a boundary in the studio space to prevent them from getting too close to all of your supplies. That being said, during things like varnishing, I do regularly find little teeny, almost invisible hairs will get into the varnish, and that's something that honestly, after I finish like filming the varnish video, I will go back to that panel that has the wet varnish on it, and I will selectively like push or pull or tweeze off those little tiny bits that shouldn't be in the varnish. And I got one comment that isn't a question, but I 100% find it really important, and I want to address it in this video, which is that I had one commenter share that they would add to my studio space a VOC air cleaning unit. 100% yes. Every studio space, if you're using solvent, really needs to have some kind of VOC specific air purifier. In a perfect world, I would have a separate like air conditioning unit that's just for this space that would be designed to like have really high airflow and address the fumes that come off of odorless mineral spirits really proactively. So do as I say, not as I do, because I don't have something like that in my studio yet. Another thing you can do is like always paint with an open window. But of course that might not be an option in certain parts of the world, or during certain times of year. So one thing I actually just added to my studio space is a filtration unit, and I just didn't happen to have it in that video, and I'm definitely excited to like upgrade that as time goes on and get like heavier duty filtration to address the fact that, yeah, oil painting comes with fumes so long as you're using solvent. One way that I try to minimize this is that I like to keep my Gamsol canister closed anytime I'm not actively using it. So basically the only time I open that up at this point is to clean brushes at the end of a painting session. And sometimes I will use it for a wash at the beginning of a painting session. So speaking of solvent and medium, one commenter asked, may I know if you're using linseed oil or liquid? And the answer is that I'm using neither. I am using Rublev's Oleogel, which is very similar to Gamblin's solvent-free gel medium. I just really like the consistency of it. I don't think there's anything wrong with using linseed oil. I haven't personally used liquid, and I don't typically want the faster drying time that liquid provides. So that's probably not something I will reach for. And on a similar note, one commenter asks, I really hope this isn't a dumb question. Do you not rinse off the Murphy's oil soap after having suspended brushes in it? Also, is it bad to leave brushes in a terp container when not in use? Okay, so what I will say is that I have not perfected this, but sometimes I find that after I do like a deep clean in Murphy's oil soap, or I leave brushes soaking in safflower oil as like a brush dip, sometimes I find that like if I just pull them out and don't do any further cleaning steps other than removing the excess soap or excess oil, they can dry really stiff. So what I've taken to doing is going ahead and just giving, like pulling all the excess out and then giving them a swish in Gamsol and then pulling the excess Gamsol out. And I find that that like makes them even cleaner. So I like that step, and I feel that it gives the brushes a better texture and feel after they've like dried back out. And similarly, as far as like whether or not it's bad to leave brushes in a container, oh, this might be a question for brush experts, and I am not one of them, but I don't typically leave them in a brush container even for a short period. And honestly, the reason is that I tend to like to leave my Gamsol container closed as much as I can. And I suspect that like leaving brushes soaking in that container doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. I think like sure, it might help get you a little bit of a head start on cleaning, but I'm not sure how much a head start you get, but you risk deforming like the bristles as they sit like bristled down in that container. And you know, you're leaving that container open. So I prefer not to. I don't know if you're like ruining your brushes per se if you do that, even for a short period. I definitely wouldn't do it for a long period. But if it's all the same to you, I would probably like leave the brushes in a different spot and just go to your Gamsol container when it's time to clean. Okay, with that, let's talk a little bit about painting. So I had a lot of questions about reference and how long it takes for me to make these paintings. And I think these questions actually go hand in hand. So I don't know that anyone has explicitly asked me this, but I get the feeling that people don't have an accurate sense of like how these paintings come together. So what you see me doing in these videos is very rarely real time. Almost all of this footage is either edited down to remove places where I'm mixing paint or just not doing something on the canvas. And oftentimes that footage is sped up as well so that you aren't watching a 2-hour video. So typically my paintings take between an hour and 5 hours to create. They might be made over a longer span of time, and some of the paintings you see on my channel did take substantially more time than 5 hours. It could be a 5-hour painting that I did over the course of a month, or it could be a like 25-hour painting that I did over the course of a week. It's hard to say, but in general, especially for small pieces, I'd say like between 1 and 3 hours is a pretty safe bet. And then that gets edited down so that it's like a 10 to 20 minute YouTube video. And then I record my voiceover on top of that. So I'm not painting and talking simultaneously. And similarly, even though you can't see it, just off camera, I typically have my photo reference for that painting right there. So none of the paintings you see me create on this channel are from imagination or from memory. I always have a reference, and my reference is typically like pretty literal to what I'm going to create. I put a lot of time into editing reference and making any adjustments to it that I need to make so that I'm not making planning decisions in the middle of the painting process. So I'm never going by the seat of my pants. I'm never painting from imagination. And these paintings take a lot more time than they probably look like they do. And I'm almost never talking and painting at the same time. So if you're ever wanting to paint while I'm painting or follow along with a painting, definitely know that I am not painting in real time, and you should not rush to keep up with me because that would be very unfair to yourself. So speaking of reference, one commenter asks if I can lend advice to help people understand what a good reference is. And they say no matter how I word it, I still get terrible photos from potential clients, and they seem offended when I suggest a different one. Yeah, so this is a really tricky topic, and I have learned to really state what I need to make a great painting right from the get-go. And I'm also really, really clear that what makes a great reference photo isn't necessarily a great photo. So you can have a photograph that you really love, and that might not set you up to make a really great painting. And I refer back to this very, very often. In that way, if they do send me something that isn't a fit, I can comment on all of the parts of the photo that I think are really endearing, or just how easy it is to understand why they love this photo so much. But I go back to things like, oh, I need a certain lighting structure, or I need this to be taken from a certain angle. So whenever possible, I offer to take photos myself. I find that really reduces the friction. And if there is no way for me to take photos myself, which the only instance I can think of is like a memorial portrait, I will be really upfront and I will say, send me all the pictures you have, and I'll tell you whether or not there are any that I could use to turn it into a painting. And if I can't, I will refer you to somebody who might be a better fit for the reference photos that you do have. All right, and I am down to my last question here, which is from a commenter who says that they aren't sure what compressing values means. And this is something that I hear a lot. So I hope that if you stuck around to the end, that this question is worth it, because this is something that I think is confusing for a lot of people. And I apologize if I don't often explain what this term means. So when I talk about compressing the value or compressing the color in a painting, basically what I am describing is reducing the contrast, whether I mean reducing the contrast value-wise, so you don't have quite an expansive range of lights all the way to darks, or reducing the variety color-wise, so you might not have vivid colors at every end of the spectrum, and everything might be a little bit more subdued and pulled toward the middle of that spectrum. So this can look like a lot of different things, but I think one really great example is if you're familiar with Impressionist paintings really very often compress both their values and a lot of what you see in terms of color toward the lights. It's not universal, but you can think of, if you can imagine a value scale, so 1 to 9, with 1 being your lightest light and 9 being your darkest dark. You can have paintings that are full contrast. So there's some pure white on that canvas and there's some pure black on that canvas. I would say that is a very uncompressed value structure for a painting. But when you think of an impressionistic painting, your darkest dark might only be like a value 3. So you might only have the value range going from a value 1 to a value 3, and everything would be staying very, very light. Similarly, if we're talking about compressing color, this would mean that your colors are harmonized really well. You don't have really high contrast, complementary, high chroma colors that are competing with one another. So this Sargent piece is a really great example of compressing the colors toward this very nice, soft, taupe, I think is the best word I have to describe it. So we do see some examples of like some blue grays in this piece. We see some very warm, honey colored neutrals in this piece, but they go really well together because there's like a little bit of blue in those warm places and there's a little bit of those warm tones in the blue areas. So this is really what I mean when I talk about compression, whether we're talking about color or we're talking about value. I think it's It's definitely hard mode for painting. You have to really commit to very subtle distinctions in terms of both value and color when you are working a little bit more compressed. But I think it makes for a really beautiful painting, and it's something really cool that you can work towards in your work. All right, and that wraps up this FAQ video. I believe I covered all of my most frequently asked questions, but if you have questions that I haven't answered in this video, please let me know in the comments and I will get started on a part 2. All right, until next time, happy painting.